Well, thanks very much. I was delighted at the invitation from Dave and from Michael. This is not my line of work in any way, shape, or form full-time, but I think that two things were critical, the second of which was, in fact, reading Michael's book, Demanding Medical Excellence, which shook many scales from my eyes. For those of you who perhaps know a little bit about my work, I wrote a book in 1982 that some number of people were kind enough to purchase, and at the center of that book was a focus on putting the customer first. Perhaps within the healthcare environment more than some, the assumption would be that that's what business does. The answer is it was not, and it is not. I remember when I would wander around in the 1980s and talk about putting the customer first, and I might literally as well have been giving a speech in Swahili as in English, so there is nothing automatic. I'd also add just a couple of things personally, listening to the beginning of Dave's remarks. I am the not Dave. Now you may wonder what that means. What it means is that I'm here in Boston today because I own a farm in Vermont, and I purchased the farm in Vermont because there was a 51-year-old prior owner who had bypass surgery, was sent home, and died 3 days later of an infection. So I love my farm. It's a lousy way to having gotten it, and it certainly makes my attention to this issue in a way very personal. The special thing that happened to me, I suppose, relative to the topic here today, is I lived for 35 years in Silicon Valley, and my first partner in my business happened to have a friend. It's always happened to have a friend who knew the person who was running this completely invisible 12-bed unit in Pacific Presbyterian Hospital in San Francisco. Several iterations later, it was Plaintree. It is today the Plaintree Alliance. Most of you are more expert than I, and I am not sent here from Derby, Connecticut to push the Plaintree Alliance down anyone's throat, but I will say that I have observed thousands of organizations over the years, and the Plaintree approach is as extraordinary as any that I've ever seen. I don't want to spend too much time on this, and I hate to read a mission statement to you because in general I think mission statements are a waste of breath or paper or ones and zeros on a screen. But this one is worthwhile. This is the joint Plaintree Alliance and Griffin Hospital statement. We believe that we are human beings caring for other human beings. We are all caregivers. Caregiving is best achieved through kindness and compassion. Safe, accessible, high-quality care is fundamental to patient-centric care. In a holistic approach to meeting people's needs of body, mind, and spirit. Families, friends, and loved ones are vital to the healing process. Access to understandable health information can empower individuals to participate in their health. The opportunity for individuals to make personal choices related to their care is essential. Physical environments can enhance healing, health, and well-being. Illness can be a transformational experience for patients, families, and caregivers. I don't know of anything else that's written in quite those words, and obviously words can very much be not worth the air they're spoken from. And obviously in the Plaintree Alliance, which now includes hundreds of members, there is not equality of outcome. Some are good, some are bad, some are indifferent. But the program itself is exceptional. Michael, could you do me a favor and go up to the top row where my colleague Shelley is standing and bring down 2 T-shirts, please. For those of you who, again, don't know of the origin of that 12-bed unit was a patient at Pacific Presbyterian who, when she left Pacific Presbyterian, and I think it was 1974, was irritated that she had had no information about her problem and donated all of about 5 cents or probably $1,000 to establish a small medical library. I mean, you may wonder why I asked Michael to bring down my 2 T-shirts. This tradition continues. I was at Griffith a few months ago and received these 2 T-shirts. Among other things, Griffin now has, for patients, people off the street in Derby or what have you, an 18-week patient information seminar. T-shirt number 1 is, "Trust me, I'm almost a doctor."
Tom, could
you want to?
Here, sure.
Absolutely.
This is going to Twitter.
I would have worn it if I'd known that. And you must get the back then, obviously.
Sorry, I need a retake on the front.
Okay, well, you do that at your leisure, sir. I mean, Griffin Hospital Mini Med School. And the second, which is pretty much the same, is simply, there's the front, and the back is Griffin Hospital. I graduated Mini Medical School in just 18 weeks. I mean, they're very, I sat in on a couple of hours worth of instruction, which takes place in a lovely library on the ground floor near the entrance to Griffin, and it was an amazing experience. They live it, they're serious about it. I will say, however, that as was implied, this isn't easy. Nothing happens unless there is significant culture change, and with significant culture change, you still don't get it right the first, second, or 10th time. Mayo Clinic has had patient-centered, team-based medicine since the year 1910, when William Mayo gave a speech to that result, or that end, and they still haven't gotten it right. I agree with Dave that pounding on clinicians is a lousy idea. On the other hand, this is an excerpt from an excellent book on Mayo called Management Lessons from Mayo Clinic. The personnel committees on all 3 campuses have become aggressive in addressing the issue of physicians who are not living the Mayo value of exhibiting respectful, collegial behavior to all team members. Some physicians have been suspended without pay or terminated. That's strong. I don't believe in pounding on clinicians either. On the other hand, this is tough work. 2 excellent books from Plaintree, by the way, Putting Patients First, and then the second edition thereof, which is a collection of case studies. I'm a strong believer in best practices and stealing ideas from anywhere. And I'm a strong believer because I was trained as a behavioralist. And the reality is, if you can get people to do the right thing, they will be delighted. I had a good friend who was involved in fundraising. She was a New Englander. New Englanders don't know how to do things like say thank you. I taught this person to say thank you and write thank you letters, and as I guessed, the feedback was so fabulous to her that she thought, this is cool, I think I'll send more thank you letters. So while I believe that grand gestures are important, I think also that if you can get people to exhibit useful behaviors and they are not idiots, which virtually nobody is in this business, it's a start.
Well, first, I'll ask our other 2 speakers, do you have any observations on what we've done so far before we open it to questions? No?
I just want to comment very briefly on what Tom said about Mayo. What he read was an example, not pounding on clinicians, but clinicians holding themselves accountable. right? And so now we've had a culture where even in group practices, the metric has often been a production metric, right? How many patients do you see per day, per week, or whatever? We can measure that. And clinicians know that other clinicians are not perhaps good with patients or perhaps abusive to nurses, but they haven't done anything about it. Again, even in group medical practices. And what Tom is referencing as part of cultural change is the complement to what you've heard Dave and I talk about, which is not merely outsiders, patients holding clinicians accountable, but clinicians holding themselves accountable and their colleagues for exhibiting the values that the best amongst them want to exhibit. And I think that's an important point to reemphasize.
Let me, Michael, just add one thing to that. This is not the sort of language one hears from scientifically trained people, such as doctors. But to your point, this is a Dr. Nina Schwenk, who is a staff physician and new to Mayo. Listen to the term. I am hundreds of times better here than at my prior hospital because of the support system. It's like you were working in an organism. You are not a single cell when you're out there practicing. And you know, words like hundreds presumably are not thrown around lightly, even if they are not quantitatively quite accurate.
You know, and I'd like to echo something on that. We talk about improving quality and safety by making our systems work better. And you know, we're here to talk about it in the context of the patient's role. But there's another dimension to this. You know, I mentioned earlier how heartbroken I was at the pediatric nurse who killed herself last year. My primary physician, Danny Sands, says that he finds it more satisfying when he's working with engaged patients. And considering the amount of work that it takes, right, to become a physician, I mean, far beyond my education. For heaven's sake, I just have a bachelor's degree and I didn't do all that well. And it just seems to me that, you know, to take a doctor like that who worked that hard and was good enough to be hired at a place like Mayo and have them experience that level of increased job satisfaction, you know, because I mean, who doesn't go through that training with the desire of being really great? So, do you?
Well, I'll just make a comment. I mean, you know, I think now in residency program, actually a lot of clinicians are being provided this alternative, and you might have read a lot of case studies around improving bedside manners and how you can actually coordinate care through better communication. That was not the scenario 20 years ago or 25 years ago, but when I graduated from residency, it certainly was taking shape, and now it's becoming more and more part of the curriculum. So I guess it's, again, defining better care. It's getting both the communities together so that we're not siloed and then have a shared joint decision-making capabilities.
So what I'd like to do to make this, because I know you're all going to be filling out evaluations and I want this to be useful, you know, good use of your time. I'd like to, if anybody who has a question, come to that microphone or this one down here, or just raise your hand and I'll repeat the question for the audience online. But I'm also, I'm really interested to think, you know, we come to conference after conference, year after year, and most of the discussion about the statistics stays pretty much the same. What do you see? Have you heard anything new in Helen's talk, in our talks here today, about how we can actually make things work out better? You know, a case like any of the ones that Helen mentioned, or Dwayne Smith, what if his family had Googled splenectomy, or any of the ways that we can, you know, in Mike Berry's talk this morning, you know, giving more information to the consumers. Any thoughts? What would you like to talk about? Are you going to leave with the ability to do anything different when you go back to your regular job? Any thoughts? Anybody else here? How about, I'm sorry, in the back row, did you raise your hand at the very beginning, Mr. Yellow Shirt? Or?
I did. I'm staff for this, but I'm happy to talk. The one thing I heard Helen talk about was the bedside shift. I had not heard that. I'm not an expert in patient safety, but I'm an expert in people taking account accountability and apologizing for their error, because when the Pennsylvania Medical Center caused my mother's death as a medical error, refused even to acknowledge it, it still makes me angry.
Okay, let me recap that for the online audience. So the gentleman who's speaking is not an attendee here, he's actually conference staff. But of course, you know, we don't see these people. We don't know that there are medical stories walking around us all the time. He's interested in this subject, his own mother's death, caused by, did you say, a medical error? And the hospital not even acknowledging it. And so then, continue?
Well, that's the reason why this whole business of transparency and accountability and encouraging people to speak up.
Yes, he also said that in his professional work, and this goes to Tom's point about stealing best practices from other industries, right? He is accustomed to people being accountable and taking responsibility and owning up to things and improving, right? So do you see, what do you think? Can you see a way in your mother's own case where if you had been engaged more in the care at the bedside? He also said that he had not been familiar with the idea of bedside shift change. Can you think of a way that might have improved things?
I don't know how it could. I mean, my father was there when she went through open heart surgery.
Mm-hmm.
The cardiac surgeon said it was successful and she died in recovery.
Yes.
The cardiac surgeon, I think, did not know my mother had died until 2 days later when somebody put a tube in wrong or something in recovery and she bled out. They had to put her back up and she couldn't survive. The hospital described it as a normal course of operation,
Mm-hmm.
and they were forced by the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania to recall the death certificate and say that's not so, and you can't say that. Now, my father.
I'm sorry, this is tremendously interesting. If you could go to the microphone, that would be great.
Yes, that would, thanks.
Because there's one right here on the stairs.
Well, or Michael, you could run it up to him. It's not on a
I'll run
cord.
up. Is it a cordless microphone?
Yeah, it's.
Dominate the conversation. I'm supposed to be helping you.
No, I'd love to. If it's cordless, I'll run it up to you. If it's cordless,
Stop it. Anyway, to recap, my mother died of a medical error in the hospital. My father was there. He didn't know what he was supposed to ask, and didn't know until it was over when there'd been an error. And the family didn't know for a week until the state forced the hospital to recall the death certificate and say, no, it was not a normal consequence of surgery, it was a medical error. So I don't know whether we had been more activated as a family, we could have done much, but what stuck in my craw was the refusal of the hospital administration to acknowledge that they made an error. And so I'm a big fan of sorry works and accountability and apologizing and taking responsibility and figuring out what caused it and talking to the family about what you do. And so that's why I'm inspired by people like Helen and Michael and you all.
Well, one thing I'd add to this in a crude sense is that saying I'm sorry pays. There's an extremely interesting story from right around here, the VA hospital in Lexington, Massachusetts, which began a program of apology and apology without being asked to apologize. One part of the outcome of that was the median VA hospital malpractice settlements across the United States were $413,000 per event. At Lexington, it was $36,000. And, the nastiest, crustiest, toughest CEOs presumably can tell the difference between the two. I find it at some level in my own corporate world almost amusing, though none of the process is funny. Toro, the lawnmower people, introduced the same thing, and so I can imagine them apologizing for cutting off arms and legs. Their average settlement dropped from $115,000 to $35,000. And think of what I'm talking about here, a lawnmower company. They have not been to trial in the last 20 years. And it was simply, and the part that is added to that is when apology becomes standard, as happened in the VA, then errors become reported and the database grows. At the VA, the increase in the error database has been by a factor of 30 since that policy was introduced.
I want to add, first of all, thank you so much for sharing the story with us. And I think it teaches us some important lessons. So the first is there is a limit to what patient involvement can do. I'm on the board of a Chicago organization called Project Patient Care. And one of the most distressing stories was someone who's a healthcare professional, not a physician. Her father went in for surgery. She warned them about a particular complication from giving them a drug. It happened to be at a VA hospital, actually, in Chicago. And they did it anyway, and they didn't acknowledge the error. And the only way she found out about the error is while she was talking to the doctors, the investigative group came in and started talking about what they found, which contradicted what the doctors were telling her. They didn't know who she was. And she discovered there was an error. The second thing is there is hope. Beyond the kind of program that Tom mentioned, the University of Illinois at Chicago has started a program that's got national kind of buy-in started to with 7 pillars with this kind of apology, but beyond that, to immediately go into root cause analysis and involving the patient in hospital-level safety committees. That is, the stuff that is the holy of holies, you don't let patients in to listen to what mistakes you've made. University of Illinois has started doing that. And I happened to go to visit them when they had their, to learn about the program, when there was an incident. And they've got everybody in the hospital trained to call them immediately. They talk to the CEO immediately. It's disclosed immediately. Some patients who had a problem. And in this case of, they actually had an error which killed a young woman. Basically a routine kind of procedure, and everybody got so busy, nobody checked her blood pressure, right? And she started to have this reaction, and they gave her this drug, and nobody checked to see, well, this drug isn't going to work. She has no blood pressure, it's not circulating, and she died. In her 30s, a couple of young kids. After they finished their investigation, and after they finished working with the family, the father of this woman who became involved with the hospital chose to go back to the same hospital for his heart care. Chose to be cared for at that hospital, saying he felt safer there than anywhere else. So there are good things happening, and it's sad that the hospital you had that experience with has not learned that lesson yet.
Well, Michael, as you well know, that same story is is produced almost precisely in Josie's story, which is what got Peter Pronovost going. And it was the work he did with Hopkins first to get him to acknowledge the problem, and then turning the woman or the mother into a true advocate.
And as you know, that leads to my cynical halfway line. How many doctors being killed by medical errors would it cause for there to be a crisis, right? Yes. So we actually know the answer to that question. So we have, let's say, 100,000 patients being killed in hospitals alone by preventable medical errors. That is, preventable hospitals only. We have 600,000 physicians. How many doctors would we have to kill for medical errors to be a crisis? 1,000, 100? How many would it take? Well, we sort of know the answer to that from a natural experiment. When the HIV/AIDS virus came along, how many healthcare workers did it take to be infected or killed before it was a crisis? And the answer is it was somewhere between 3 and 10. So if we had somewhere between 3 and 10 doctors killed or injured by medical errors, it would be a crisis. Unfortunately, the saying in the airline pilot industry is the pilot is the first one at the scene of the accident. A little different in medicine.
So I want to get back to the subject. We have about 10 minutes left. The subject of patients, engaging and empowering patients in quality and safety. I'll toss out 2 thoughts. One involves something that I'm sure many of you are familiar with, the story of Sue Sheridan's husband, whose unfortunate pathology result, you've got brain cancer, got filed without ever being reported to the family. They never even knew about it until she requested his records after his death.
Just
yes?
What happened was he came back in for a checkup to the hospital after a year, and the resident walked in and says, "Oh my God, how come you took a year?" And he'd been told he was normal. And he said, what do you mean? And then They discovered.
Okay, good. So that's different than the version I read. Thank you. You probably,
Yeah, I've talked to you.
yeah, okay, good. So my appeal here is, please, please, please do everything you can to get your providers to support online automated delivery of lab results. Okay, if you need political fuel for that or evidence, some fuel for that, the SGIM, Society for General Internal Medicine, hosted a debate in their newsletter, I think it was in February, about this. And there's a, please, please, please. Doesn't cost a lot. I mean, everybody's going to be going online, and that debate very well debunks all the reasons not to do that. All right. And then the other thing is, every single person I know who has looked at their own medical record has found mistakes in it, some small, some large. In particular, missing allergies are a real biggie that can cause a real problem. And so please get your organization, your institutions, everyone you talk to get patients involved in checking the medical records. I have found, as a guy I'm a data geek in my day job, always have been, and you know, there can be junk in the system that nobody's ever looked at, and it doesn't make any difference. But then you go back and look at the historical data, you generate a report on the screen, and you say, what? You go back and look at the data and find out the data is garbage. So all this garbage that's been in the attics now is going to be getting used. It's a great time before there's a crisis to get people involved in sharing responsibility for what's in the system. So those are two concrete things you can work on. Any
Dave,
comments?
I'm actually going to make a comment here, and I think this is going back to your patient empowerment and engagement. And a lot of actually employers or a lot of managed care companies, which are your health plans, are now providing something known as personal health records, which is something that you can even have it on your mobile device, whether you are traveling internationally or locally or wherever. But it has all the information that if you ever saw a doctor and you actually fed into that information, you will have it at your fingertips. And then you're even able to, so say if you worked at some, I don't know, Fortune 500 company and you decided to leave it after 5 years, you can still take that data with you, it stays with you, and I think that's a very key point, that how engaged and empowered you are with your own medical history, and you're able to share it with your provider.
Great, I'll come back to that. Yes.
Dave, I actually have a physician online who wanted to make a comment earlier. And I'm a physician. I'm 100% sure that medical students should have a rotation where they would be a patient at a hospital, be hospitalized, and see what it's like.
Oh, absolutely, sure. The most amazing, sorry, Mike, did you raise your hand or you just said yeah? That's both.
Finish your thought.
Well, there is no end to my thoughts, so why don't you engage with us? This is Mike Berry, the president of the Informed Decision Making Foundation, who gave a keynote this morning.
But sort of a question for you, Dave, but maybe everyone. The point you mentioned, and it came up in the plenary talks this morning, about how difficult it is for patients to speak up, particularly if it's at all seen as pushing back against recommendations. Right. That's coming up in study after study now. And then we do physician surveys, and Mike showed a little bit of that data where the physicians say, well, I want patients to participate, but they don't say anything, so I think they want me to make the decision for them. So there's this folie à deux where the patient is afraid to speak up, and the physician interprets that as not having anything to say. So breaking that cycle seems really important. So the issue of how, and it probably starts with clinicians a lot of the time, what does that invitation to participate sound like to you as a patient, whether it be coming into the hospital or starting a new relationship for the physician, or in an existing relationship where a decision comes up that needs to be made?
Let me
Tom?
just say one thing which is just to reinforce the point. I am 70 years old. I'm trained as a scientist. I've been reasonably successful, and I'm terrified of being considered a difficult patient. I had a situation which was completely uncalled for in a major medical center in a northeastern city in the U.S., and I didn't have the nerve to say anything about it. And I'm 70, for God's sakes. And just to suggest how incredibly
I want to make a
high that
confession also. Can I
barrier
make a
is.
confession too, Dave, and we'll let you answer the question. So when I was writing Demanding Medical Excellence, before I was as empowered as I am today, but I had gone to see my primary care physician who I had a good relationship with. And he'd done a physical, and he'd done no blood work. Now, I was in my 30s, and I said, okay. And I went to one doctor I was interviewing and saying, can you do a physical without any blood work? And he said, no. And I went to another doctor and said, can you do a physical without any blood work? I said, yeah. And I went to a third doctor and said, why don't you ask your doctor why he made the decision? That was much more terrifying than the blood work.
Absolutely.
Interesting. So to answer your question, now that I'm going around speechifying at all these different places, I love the fact that people are saying, 2 years ago, people said, are you kidding? You're a unicorn. And then people said, there might be something to this. Now people are saying, okay, where do we start? Right? That's great. That's the beginning of culture change. So one thing this May, I posted on my blog during the event, here it is, the magic incantation. All right, say this and you'll be an e-patient. And what it was, in fact, I recently had a skin cancer taken off. I met up with a new dermatologist, so I had a chance to say, now what do I say here? And I said, I'm the kind of patient who likes to understand as much as I can about my condition. Can I ask some questions? All right, so there's nothing confrontational to that. It's normal. Back in the 60s, when I was a hippie, we called this consciousness raising. Becoming sensitive to what you would like, and then being willing to speak up about it, okay? Now, another thing is, one way that I ended up with my current doctor who I love is that I decided I had some bad experiences earlier in life, which as a Consumer Reports reader, I related to getting bad service from any provider of any service, so I voted with my feet. You know, I had moved. Now, there's something that's a significant obstacle here, which ties into something that Dr. Anisha mentioned, which is, you know, it's one thing for me to decide I don't like Circuit City, so I go to Best Buy, you know, or I don't like my current Toyota service place, so I go to another one. Taking our medical records with us is not easy today. If the regulations roll out the way we want them to, that will put information in the hands of consumers, the patients, right? So you can take your kids or your mother's business, your care relationship somewhere else if it's not what you want. Once that happens, Katie bar the door, like any other industry, people will start to shape up when they start seeing patients leave. But the problem with most PHRs is that they're not a portal into the full record. Like at my hospital, Beth Israel Deaconess, we have this thing invented in 1999 called Patient Site, which is much better than most hospitals offer today. They supposedly have a new version coming along. Well, number one, it clearly was designed in the year of Web 1.0, not easy to navigate at all. But number two, it doesn't actually show me what's in the doctor's records. But that's where the Robert Wood Johnson Open Notes project, which just concluded this spring, and the results will be published this fall, answers the cultural objection of, wait a minute, if we let patients see the record, won't we be flooded with stupid phone calls about what does SOB mean and things like that? So putting the information, I think, in the hands, and then also, you know, we have work to do. So here's my bottom line, again, dating back to the 60s. When I was in college in Boston in the 60s, it was the time when feminism was just emerging. You know, and I'll never forget, right after I graduated, there was this radical, scary book called Our Bodies, Ourselves that got published, where women were actually taught how to look at themselves with a mirror and understand what was going on and everything. That book now, and they were decried by the medical profession, but now that book's in its 13th edition, and it also has more simplified competitors and things like that. As I talk to medical conferences, I hear a shift in the wind in what people talk about at conferences. But my metric is when the people I bump into at my supermarket would understand what I'm doing, then we've changed. And the cultural touchstone for that, for me, in feminism, was the movie 9 to 5. When it really reached the consumer conversation, and in particular stories, we had the unlikely combination of Lily Tomlin and Dolly Parton, right, and Jane Fonda. Talk about, is there anybody we've left out yet, right? And they demonstrated in an entertaining way, this is what it looks like when your boss is being a jerk. This is how you realize, I don't like that. Or, I want something different. This is how you speak up and take action. So I'm actually pitching to people, let's have stories on the Hallmark Channel, right, of a family member, probably a woman. In my mom's cases last year, it was my alpha sister who really ran the show, right, intervenes, speaks up, and improves the outcomes. So you can see why I said I wanted to hear from you first. So we have a couple of minutes left. Anything else? I really hope that when you go back to your desk job, you'll be doing something differently. Yes, one more in the back.
So this may not be a completely different question, but I'd like to expand on what Dr. Berry asked you to talk about, which is what would it sound like from the clinician's side? So I hear you saying what a patient can do. What would you like the doctors to do? We're being told and to a certain extent taught now to elicit preferences and values from patients. I haven't yet been taught a really effective way to elicit a patient's preferences and values in a broad sense. For narrow decisions, yes, but in the broad sense, it's a lot harder, and that conversation is a lot more challenging, difficult, long.
I have some thoughts on that, but I wonder what anyone else has, either from your own experience as a patient, how would you like to be talked to, or those of you who are clinicians. By the way, in any conversation like this, I presume when somebody says doctor, they mean clinicians, all forms of nursing and so on. Any thoughts? Well, I'll say that what I like and what I've heard anecdotally has been effective is for a clinician to ask me, what's important to you? Why do you want, is there any particular reason you'd like to be healthy? Or because some people really don't. There was a friend of my wife's got the same diagnosis as me a year later, and we offered to connect him to the doctors who saved me, and he said, no, I'm okay, I'm ready to go. So I don't assert that anybody else should act like me. In fact, one of the great things from a plenary this morning, the issue, the importance of living forever versus saving the breasts. There was just a blog post, and it was on KQED in San Francisco a couple of weeks ago. A 50-year-old woman whose doctors recommended a double mastectomy, and she said, I don't think I want that. I understand that I might die at 75 instead of 90, but I'd rather keep the breasts. Now, who else is in a better position? This is informed, shared medical decision-making, right? So anybody have any other reactions to that idea of being asked what's important to you? And it's important also not to be hurried. There's got to be time for that to come out.
Well, one thing I would say, again, looking at the world that I engage in, is that this stuff can be taught. I mean, the number one issue, arguably, and I think it was Michael, you were citing that evidence on the time of interruption. People can be taught to listen better, but it doesn't happen in a single lecture at medical school or business school. But my grand argument in my world is, relative to leadership, everything is taught in the world of leadership except what's important. And what's important, for starters, is how to listen. And I ask in corporations, how many corporations have a full-bore, start-to-finish course on listening that everyone from the CEO to the receptionist must take, and which must be renewed on a biannual basis? And so this is these, with all due respect to our clinicians, learning how to listen is just as sophisticated as learning how to do heart surgery. And what's important is that these things be treated as disciplines, which they are. Listening is a discipline.
I put together with the advisory board with Rich Frankel and Howard Beckman and patients a tool called Better Health Conversations, which had to do with the doctor-patient interaction. And we did some piloting with 3 medical groups. And what was interesting Of course, it was all with practicing physicians who've been out there a while. At the beginning, pretty much all the doctors said, I don't need this. And then at the end, they were all kind of surprised. They wouldn't go so far as to say, this was an enormous change in my life, but they were all kind of surprised at what it did in terms of what they heard from their patients and how it changed the relationship. And Tom is absolutely right that there are skills to listening in medicine. It can be taught. I've had some of the black belts on our advisory group, and it is a great place to start, because the exam room to the boardroom.
So we are a little bit over. It's time to go rub elbows in the networking luncheon at the faculty club. I think what we've come down to here is really good, though, because from the economics standpoint, the art of listening ties us into what the consumer really considers valuable. In my vision of the future, there will be, in the PHR that you have for your family, a visit planner thing where you can record thoughts and notes before you get to the moment of the visit, and that can be programmed to ask questions like, what's important to you? So thanks very much for your attention. It's been great. And thanks to our panelists. Wonderful.